There is a pattern in history that governments prefer you never see. 3 times in the last century alone, the same sequence unfolded, the same stages, the same delusions, the same collapse. And right now, at this very moment, the world is following that sequence again, step by step. With terrifying precision. This is not theory, this is not conspiracy. This is documented historical fact. And the evidence is already visible to anyone willing to look beyond the surface of official narratives and central bank reassurances. The mechanism begins with a simple truth that most people never understand. Money is not what you think it is. When you deposit cash into a bank, you believe that money sits in a vault somewhere with your name on it, waiting for you to withdraw it. That is the illusion they need you to believe. The reality is that the moment your money enters the banking system, it ceases to exist as a physical entity and transforms into an accounting entry, a number on a screen that can be multiplied, leveraged, and created out of thin air, through a process so audacious that when people first learn about it, they refuse to believe. It's legal. It's called fractional reserve banking, and it is the foundation upon which the entire modern financial system rests. But more importantly, it is the mechanism through which every major economic collapse in modern history was engineered. Here is how it works, stripped of the academic language designed to obscure the truth. You deposit $1,000. The bank is required to keep only a fraction of that in reserve. Let's say 10%. That means they keep $100 and loan out $900. But here is where the magic happens. That $900 gets deposited into another account, and that bank now keeps $90 and loans out $810. That deposit creates another loan, which creates another deposit, which creates another loan, in an endless cascade of credit creation. By the time this cycle completes, your original $1,000 has generated nearly $10,000 in new money circulating through the economy, money that never existed before. Money created not by labor, not by production, not by value, but by the simple act of lending. The banks have conjured it into existence through accounting entries and legal frameworks that permit this alchemy to continue unchallenged. This system works beautifully during expansion, when economies grow, when confidence is high, when borrowers believe the future will be better than the present. This money creation fuels investment, construction, consumption, and the illusion of perpetual prosperity. But the system contains within itself a fatal flaw, a mathematical inevitability that has destroyed economies repeatedly throughout history. Because all of this created money is actually debt. Every dollar in circulation beyond the physical currency is owed to someone with interest. And here is the trap. The interest itself was never created. If banks create $100 but demand $105 back, where does that extra $5 come from? It must come from new loans, new money creation, new debt. The system can only survive if it continuously expands. The moment expansion stops, the moment confidence cracks, the entire structure begins to collapse inward on itself with devastating speed. Let us examine the pattern through history, because this is not speculation. This has happened before, multiple times, in almost identical sequences. The first great modern demonstration of this pattern occurred in the 1920s. After World War I, America entered a period of unprecedented prosperity. Credit exploded. Banks created money at rates never before seen. People borrowed to buy homes, cars, stocks, anything that promised future returns. The stock market became a fever dream of speculation, with ordinary citizens taking loans to buy shares in companies they knew nothing about, convinced that prices could only rise. Banks encouraged this because every loan they issued created new money, new profit, new fees. The economy appeared unstoppable. Production soared. Wealth seemed to be expanding infinitely. But underneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Agricultural prices were collapsing. Industrial overproduction was creating unsold inventory. Wages were stagnant while asset prices inflated to absurd levels. The money being created was flowing not into productive investment, but into speculation, into bets on the future that assumed the expansion would never end. Then in October of 1929, confidence broke. It did not break slowly. It broke suddenly, violently, irreversibly. Stock prices collapsed. Loans that had seemed secure became worthless. Overnight, banks that had created money through endless lending now faced a terrifying reality. Those loans were not being repaid, and the money they had conjured into existence was evaporating. Depositors rushed to withdraw their savings, only to discover that the money was not there. It had never been there. It existed only as ledger entries backed by loans that were now defaulting. Banks collapsed by the thousands, not because they were robbed, not because of external invasion, but because the system of money creation had reversed, and debt deflation was consuming the economy. Every dollar of debt that defaulted destroyed $10 of created money. The money supply contracted by a third. Unemployment reached 25%. The Great Depression had arrived, and it would take a world war to finally break the deflationary spiral. But governments and central banks learned nothing from this collapse, or rather, they learned the wrong lessons. They concluded that the problem was not the system itself, but merely the lack of intervention during the crisis. So they built new mechanisms, new institutions, new tools to prevent bank runs and stabilize the money creation process. They created deposit, insurance, central bank emergency lending, regulatory frameworks to control the pace of credit expansion. They convinced themselves they had tamed the pattern, that they had engineered a system that could expand forever without collapsing, and for a time, it seemed to work. The post-war era brought decades of growth, rising standards of living, technological progress, and the widespread belief that modern economics had solved the boom-bust cycle. But the pattern does not care about belief or regulatory frameworks. By the 1980s and 90s, the system was expanding again, faster than ever. Financial deregulation unleashed a new wave of money creation. Banks were no longer constrained by traditional lending limits. They created exotic financial instruments, derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, structures so complex that even the bankers selling them did not fully understand them. But complexity was the point. Complexity obscured the fundamental reality that this was still the same old game. Creating money through debt, multiplying leverage, and praying that confidence never breaks. Housing became the new speculation engine. People who could never afford homes were given loans because banks knew they could bundle those loans, sell them as securities, and pass the risk to someone else. Money flowed into real estate at exponential rates. Prices soared. Everyone believed housing prices could never fall. They all thought they were different. They all thought this time was different. Then in 2008, the same pattern repeated. Confidence broke. Housing prices fell. Mortgages defaulted. The securities backed by those mortgages became worthless. Banks that had leveraged themselves 30 to 1, 40 to 1, suddenly faced insolvency. Bear Stearns collapsed. Lehman Brothers collapsed. The entire global financial system teetered on the edge of total disintegration. And once again, the money that had been created through debt vanished. Credit markets froze, lending stopped. The money supply began contracting. The deflationary spiral was beginning again. But this time, governments and central banks intervened with unprecedented force. They printed trillions in new money. They bought worthless assets from banks. They guaranteed deposits, loans, entire financial institutions. They flooded the system with liquidity to prevent the collapse from completing its cycle. And it worked in the sense that it prevented immediate systemic failure. But it did not fix the underlying problem. It merely delayed the reckoning and made the next crisis inevitable and far larger. Because here is what they did instead of allowing the bad debt to be cleared. Instead of allowing the money creation process to reverse and reset, they papered over the losses with newly printed currency. They bailed out the banks that had created the crisis. They lowered interest rates to zero, making it easier to borrow, encouraging even more debt creation. They convinced themselves that the solution to too much debt was more debt, that the solution to too much money creation was more money creation. And for more than a decade, this seemed to work. Asset prices inflated again. Stock markets reached record highs. Real estate boomed again. Governments borrowed at levels never seen in peacetime. Corporations borrowed to buy back their own. Shares. Consumers borrowed to maintain lifestyles their incomes could no longer support. The money supply exploded to levels that would have seemed insane just 20 years earlier.